Nicaragua is experiencing a deep social and political crisis. Since April 18th, there have been hundreds of deaths and thousands of people have been injured, and the demonstrations against President Ortega have not stopped. The country seems to be on a road to a showdown after more than 100 days of continuous protest. What is the future for Nicaragua? What role will President Ortega play in it? You have been everything to the Nicaraguan people, a liberator, a leader of the masses and a historical figure. Now the people are out on the street asking you to leave. Why is that?
First of all, it's not all the people, just a part of the population. We've had an opposition here all along. And that's obviously taken part in the elections. We've had previous elections in which we participated and didn't get the majority. The majority was won by the opposition forces, and all of them united under the mandate of US politics.
But we're talking about the current protests in Nicaragua. A recent poll shows that 79% of Nicaraguans want you to leave. At least it's reasonable to doubt that the Nicaraguan people want you to remain in power.
But I believe there's a good part of the population. I can't give you the percentage in surveys. I don't know of any accurate polls right now.
Don't you think there's been an outcry on the streets that might make you feel tempted to consult with the people, for example, by calling an election?
But we've had elections recently. We recently had elections. And what we've had now is an attempted coup. That's what we've experienced, what the people have suffered. And I want to clarify for the Euronews audience, because I've read that it says 100 days, 90 days, 300 dead already here in Nicaragua. Well,
the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights says so. Other organizations say 400.
These figures aren't true. The real figure of these clashes that have been taking place since April the 18th, these violent confrontations between the opposition and the government, between the police and the Sandinista population, have resulted in 195 deaths. And of course, if we add to this the average number of deaths that Nicaragua had before April the 18th, which is one of the lowest rates in the region, 2 deaths per day, if we add this to 2 deaths per day, we'd have 180 more. What these human rights bodies do, they count them all together.
So according to you, they're manipulating the figures.
They count everything. How do you explain that during this period there were no deaths due to common crimes?
That's not what they say. The organizations that talk about these deaths do not say that there are no common crimes, but that the number of deaths from the protests is between 300 and 400, which is a fairly high figure.
They put it all together. Everyone who shows up as deceased is counted as deceased in these protests.
What I don't understand is, for example, you've let the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights get in to count the deaths. Why would they suddenly start manipulating the data?
These are US-funded human rights centers, precisely to manipulate figures.
What I'm wondering is, do you take any responsibility as the country's president? Because regardless of the figures we use, don't you have some responsibility for not being able to maintain the security of your citizens?
The truth is that we are facing a powerful enemy that has intervened militarily in Nicaragua. which is the United States.
I find it interesting because you've mentioned several times that these protests are funded by the United States, but I haven't seen any evidence yet. Do you have any evidence?
Of course I do.
Why haven't you shown it yet?
There are accounts that show the U.S. agencies send money to these people through various U.S. agencies. They've even said it publicly. They've announced the amount of millions they allocate to Nicaragua for democracy, as they say, but they divert it to destabilize the country and encourage armed actions by gangs that commit crimes since 2007, when we took power.
So according to you, these are US-funded protests that have no connection to the people.
It has to do with that part of the population that is affiliated to opposition forces that are in parliament, that had an active part in the blockades.
When you build up the idea of these protests as coming from a terrorist group, well, it's hard to see who the leader is, and there's no clear evidence of funding. This version does not hold up very well, does it?
If we had proceeded to arrest the leaders, I can already imagine the reaction, seeing what happened with what we've done so far, having captured those who were directly participating in the terrorist actions, those who are participating. Then the human rights organizations came out to speak for them, to defend them, and to punish Nicaragua. And the U.S. Congress came out with resolutions against Nicaragua.
I would like to ask you about the paramilitaries or paramilitary police, because they have a role which isn't very clear. Many witnesses speak of their collaboration with your security forces. And they are people who are accused of committing crimes. For example, Amnesty International speaks about extrajudicial executions. What's your view?
Amnesty International has not presented a single piece of evidence. What is public is how right-wing paramilitaries have killed at the blockades and have filmed and tortured citizens for being Sandinistas. They torture them, set them on fire, and then dance around them. It's terrorism. And Amnesty International doesn't say a word about it. The Inter-American Commission for Human Rights doesn't say anything. When they grab a cop and burn him.
There are many examples of these paramilitaries collaborating with the security forces. The BBC went to a Nicaraguan town and said they were collaborating with the police without any kind of shame.
No, here what we have is called the voluntary police.
No, but these were masked people, because the volunteer police are not masked.
The volunteer police in special operations are masked in normal time. There are even countries in Latin America where judges are masked so they don't get killed.
So these people who define themselves as paramilitaries were still volunteer police officers.
That's right, they're volunteer cops.
If you sit down at the table again for talks, what are your red lines? Is leaving power a red line, something you could not accept? Is calling elections something you could not accept under any circumstances?
First, to consolidate peace, we are committed to doing justice.
If peace were consolidated, would you be willing to call elections?
Here, we have constitutional norms that establish electoral periods. Ours ends in 2021. That's when elections will be held in Nicaragua again. In all the peace processes in which I've been involved in Central America, it was never considered that elections should be brought forward.
Forgive me for asking you this again, but I would like an answer. Are you not considering resigning at any point during the dialogue or bringing forward elections? Because calling snap elections is also constitutional.
In Central America, this has not happened. In Colombia, every time there's a peace process, elections are not brought forward, with the blood that has been shed in Central America.
So you're not even thinking about it?
No, the opposition has told me. They've even told me that I have to leave now. They shouted that at me on April the 19th. I think it would be a very serious precedent for the good of the country. If another government arrives, then the Sandinista National Liberation Front would have the right to stop the country and ask the government to leave the following day. We would be setting a precedent. It would lead to a country in anarchy.
So it's either you or anarchy. It's either you or chaos.
Yes, to follow that path is to open the door to anarchy in the country. This is not good for the country. Stability that brings security, that is important for the region. Nicaragua is the dam of organized crime and drug trafficking. A broken Nicaragua would mean that the region will be taken over by drug trafficking.
In 2017, you won your third term in office, and both your wife and some of your children began to hold important positions. Why are your family and your government so intertwined?
The only one who has ever held an important position is my partner. As a Sandinista militant, I knew her as a Sandinista militant. I found her in the Sandinista camp, and as a Sandinista militant, she has the right to hold a position. And this is the first time she's ever held it. My children are dedicated to television, to journalism. That's what they've studied.
Also oil.
No, none of them. That's what our opponents say. Simply put, first of all, we're not an oil-producing country. Here, the big corporations are the ones who run the oil industry. Then there's been a cooperation with Venezuela on oil. That's got nothing to do with the commercial operation.
It's a relationship with oil.
But that one hasn't been handled by my children.
There's a sense that the differences between your family and your government are perhaps...
The experience of the dynasty here in Nicaragua, Somoza sent his son to West Point and made him chief of the guard, chief of the army.
Luego Somoza, ¿qué hizo? Mandó a su hijo a West Point y luego lo nombró jefe de la guardia, jefe del ejército.
His other son was sent to the US to study and then appointed as a member of parliament.
Mr. President, I understand that Somoza created a dynasty, but we're talking about Nicaragua in 2018. And what I'm asking you is about the unrest in the population, and you can't deny that.
There's no country in the world where part of the population doesn't experience discontent.
Yes, but not all over the world. There is anger because there are family members within the government handling important issues.
That is false.
So you do not think there's a problem with the connections among so many official institutions and your family, your government?
They're just on TV. What kind of crime is that? Don't they have the right to work? Don't they have the right to work in a newspaper? Is it because they make a kind of journalism identified with the efforts that we make for peace? Is that bad?
Another of the complaints since 2011 is that you are clinging to power. For example, with the decision of the Constitutional Court that you could run again. Don't you understand this might be one of the reasons for the unrest?
Here in Nicaragua, we start from the principle of a constitution that was born with the revolution of 1984. We arrived in 1979, and it was said that we would never become a government. We went to the elections in 1984. We won the elections. We went to the elections in 1990. We didn't win the election, and we gave up the government. The first peaceful political transition in Nicaragua's history took place, from one government to another, because the history of Nicaragua is a history of war. When you could have two opposed governments, one from León and the other from Granada.
Why then try to run again if it was clear from your constitution, according to the Assembly, that you could not run?
In the 1984 Constitution, the Constitution was open for re-election.
But in 2011?
In 2011, I simply used the resource that President Oscar Arias used to re-elect himself in Costa Rica. President Oscar Arias is one of the most democratic presidents in Latin America.
Well, if I had Oscar Arias here, I'd ask him the same.
President Oscar Arias used this resource to be re-elected in Costa Rica and was re-elected. President Alvaro Uribe of Colombia also used this resource.
And in both cases, in Costa Rica and especially in Colombia, I would ask the same question that I'm asking you.
But if it's good for one, it's also good for another. These are principles that are open there.
But my question is it good or bad to try to get re-elected when the Constitution specifies that it's not in its spirit? Is it good or bad regardless of who does it?
We found a constitutional way, and then the current constitution was reformed. The current constitution leaves the door open. It does not prevent re-election because it was reformed.
So that you could be re-elected.
So that anyone could.
In this regard, from 2011, quite a few reputable bodies that study democracy in the country claim that democracy has deteriorated because of your alleged actions to try to stay in power. Do you consider that Nicaragua is a democracy?
It is a democracy because, in the end, it's the people who decide with their vote. The people cannot be prevented from deciding. Because, in Europe, there are systems of indefinite re-election. What is good for Europeans is bad for Latin Americans? I believe that these are universal principles. I believe that it's the people with their vote who should choose whether or not to re-elect a person. I tried to get re-elected in 1990, and I lost.
Thank you very much for being with us on Euronews, and thank you very much for giving us this interview.